Okay, welcome back on page 127. Let's just go through residual risk one more time. I've got a safe car and I'm driving safely and I'm weather aware and I'm paying attention. I'm not texting and I got my seatbelt on, but there is still is a residual risk. So every time I go to school, there's a risk that I basically have to swallow. Okay, same thing in security. Okay, so implementation, page 127. So it's going to have a management review before you go in and do anything. Perhaps a pilot test to make sure that everything works. A phased approach. You certainly don't want to do a direct cutover with, getting rid of the old controls and putting in new controls. I mean, no, that would be really bad. And so really you have to expect the unexpected during this. And hey, come on, I'm going to have a cool video to talk about this.
Then what you're saying?
One of the cross beams has gone out askew on the treadle.
But what on earth does that mean?
I don't know. Mr. Wentworth just told me to come in here and say that there was trouble at the mill, that's all. I didn't expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Okay, it's silly, but yes. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. So when you're going to have to anticipate things like this. So monitoring and review. So page 127, review the utility and the success of the framework. Is that going to work for you? Also include implementing and the implementation and operating the plan. Okay, page 128, risk management processes. There are basically three communities of interest. We talked about management, IT, and the users, okay? And so for the context of this, we could have internal and external operating environment, right? You could. So identifying the risk, and analyzing the risk, evaluating, and then treating those things that are unacceptable. So establishing the context, page 129. So external, these would be like the business-related things. Customers, suppliers, competitors. So what if you're tied to one particular supplier for this part? And maybe they're on shaky ground and you're going, oh man. Or maybe they're in someplace that's earthquake zone or tsunami prone. And you might think, this is bad. Maybe we ought to have a really large stock of this stuff on hand, because there could be some supply chain interruptions. The legal stuff, the laws and standards, and particularly if you're selling products overseas. The threat, the known vulnerabilities that you have on the outside. What are the vectors that people could use? And then support. There could be some government agencies. Now, internal, we're talking about the governance stuff. Internal stakeholders, those people have a vested interest in the outcome. And the organizational culture. Again, we're talking about humans here. So some people are going to be, kind of like the army, do it this way and don't ask any questions kind of a thing. Or the others are going to be very questioning of what's going on. And they talk about the maturity of an organization, and particularly the information system. There's even a ranking scheme on how mature your organization is. Yeah, I know. And then any experience with risk management in the past, that would be really handy. Okay, page 129, they talk about the risk identification. Identify, classify, categorize, and prioritize. So in the identification, we're not necessarily talking just IT stuff, but here we go. So the operational assets. So you have people, processes, data, software, hardware, and networking. And here's all the risk management components. You have external people and internal people, procedures, data, et cetera, et cetera. And then what? I have trusted employees, I have staff members, people we trust from outside. And then what do we do with strangers? And then, IT and business-related procedures and transmitting data and processing data and storage data, all this stuff. Okay. So it includes basically the 6 information system components, which by now you're probably familiar with because you've had a homework assignment on that. So the computer inventory, one more time, I need like the name and the IP address, the MAC address, what type it is, the serial number, manufacturing, model, operating system, location, and who is the primary user if I needed to call them on the phone and say, what the heck is going on down there, kind of a thing. People, I need to have like an organizational chart, the position they hold. Maybe like their security clearance, or in this particular, if it's a civilian organization, maybe it's just who's had that particular type of training. What are the required skills? And the procedures, it should have a description of what the procedure is, what its purpose is, and what system it's associated with. It makes sense. And then data, of course, we're going to be talking about the data classification and the data owner and the database access methods, the things we're going to, what software are we going to use to connect to the database? And then, of course, backup procedures and all that stuff. So classification is kind of similar to the way the military does things, secret and top secret and all that stuff, unclassified. Except most people just do confidential and public, and have some sort of marking scheme or color code or stamp or something that says, not for public release. So how do you determine the value of a piece of information, the asset you're trying to protect? Well, there's a couple of questions you could ask that would probably help solve this problem. How critical is this information to you? If it went away, what would happen? How critical is it to your adversaries? Maybe it's not all that important to you, but it would be very important to somebody else. You still need to know that. Does it generate revenue or profit? This actual thing. What's the cost to replace it if it disappeared? And then the cost to protect it. Again, $5 lock on a $1 product. And then is there an embarrassment or liability kind of issue involved? So if I have customer data and I use it a lot, it's valuable to me. And if I lost it, well, okay, I would have to start over with new customers. But is that information useful to your adversary? Oh, yeah, it's probably even more useful to your adversary. So they talk about this classification and value kind of a thing. So here's just some examples of, some logistics thing, supplier orders and supplier fulfillment. This is all just confidentially. And yeah, I want to protect, my supply chain and my suppliers and that kind of stuff. Customer order over SSL. Oh God, yes. I want that to be super duper secure. And customer request, okay, it's private, but, the impact to profitability kind of low. And then, keep on down the line, those things you have in the DMZ, the edge router and the web server and those kind of things. So if the web server, if you were an e-commerce company, having the web server, the home page and the application server, if those went down, oh yeah, that would be critical. But what the data classification? Well, no, having the web page, that ought to be public. So in this case, public, private, and confidential. And then whether or not what's its impact to profitability or thing. So prioritizing. So typically you'd use like a weighted score system. By the way, that's the same thing we did for this class. I don't have every single assignment and quiz and all equal weights. No, I get 30% for this and 30% for this and 12.5% for this and 12.5% and 5%, that kind of stuff. So it's the same thing. Customer order, so its revenue is high and impact on profitability and impact on reputation and total. So it comes out critically important. Okay, and then you go through this little weighted system where you give it point scores. So this is worth 0.3, this is worth 0.4, and that's worth 0.3 for a total of 1. And so you do the math and it comes out to whatever the number is. Okay, so weighted analysis is basically how you come up with the prioritization. Now that I know what I have to do first. Okay, threat assessment, page 136. So again, identifying by category, that would be really handy if you knew exactly what the threats were. So here's some examples. Software privacy, other copyright infringement, yeah. Fluctuations in power, data, and other services, that deviation of quality of service. We've seen this before. Espionage or trespass, somebody got in and copied some data or broke in. Forces of nature, floods, earthquakes, all that stuff. Right? We've seen all this stuff before. It's not necessarily sorted by anything. It's just the list. Okay, so assessing the threats, how much is the actual danger? Is it internal or external? What's the likelihood of an attack? Now that might be tough for you to come up with. You might have to go to industry sources and find what the likelihood would be. What's the severity of the loss? How prepared is the organization to deal with it? What's the expense to protect, and how much does it cost to protect? How much does it cost to recover? And then prioritization using this type of thing: information, assets, weighted score, vulnerabilities. So comparing assets to vulnerabilities, there's actually this cool little thing. This is an example of a DMZ router. So the router has little intrinsic value itself. It's just a box. However, it's a key role in protecting other assets. And so if somebody, broke the router, we don't care about the router being broken. We care about being able to bypass it and hit stuff they're not supposed to hit. Okay, and this is all pretty straightforward. You can go through and look at all this stuff, but it all just kind of makes sense. But one of the things they do is they take the threats, vulnerabilities, and assets and create a matrix, a TVA, threats, vulnerabilities, and assets, trying to match up all these things together. Now, this is kind of complicated. So there's one particular, asset, whatever the heck that is, and a particular threat, and they mark it as red. And here are the individual things. So clearly, you want to spend your money on the red and the orange first, and maybe kind of the yellows and the greens. The threat is low or the asset has very little value, so those are not on your radar at the beginning. You need to stick with the prioritization. This is the kind of stuff that you convince the CEO that you need money. You go to him and say, here's this very, very valuable asset that a lot of people want. So let's make dang sure we put our money up front to protect that. And the CEO is going to go, yeah, okay, that makes sense, right? Okay. So the risk analysis on page 142, you assign some sort of a score to each vulnerability. Now, quite frankly, it doesn't always have to deal with math. I mean, you can just come up and say 12, or on a scale of 1 to 10, a 7. Because you can just do it from gut feel. Now, you can use some math if you want to, and the book goes into great details on that. So here's kind of like a generic model they talk about. So I have a threat source, and what's the likelihood of that happening? And then what are the consequences if it happened? And then the likelihood of success. And then you have a vulnerability with a severity code. And then it causes an adverse impact. And then you come up with, okay, this is the organizational risk. So a source to event to a vulnerability causes an impact. And every single one of these could have a math to it. What is the likelihood of someone trying to get in? And then what's the likelihood of them getting in? And then what's the likelihood of them causing a problem? It's likelihood. So mitigation by controls is a classic example. If adequately protected, well, then you move on to the next one, right? The likelihood of a threat event. Likelihood is almost often, expressed as a percent, right? Or perhaps a 1 to 10 scale, something like that. So here's a risk likelihood kind of a thing. Some sort of ranking 1 to 10, 1 to 5, 0 to 5, something like that about, it'll probably never happen. Maybe in 20 years, in 10 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It may happen a lot. So how am I supposed to know what the likelihood of these things are? Are there actuary tables out there for me to use? Yeah, there's an awful lot of stuff on the internet will basically tell you, particularly from, an outside source. They really can't help you for in-source. They can't tell you, what's the likelihood of you having a disgruntled employee? Nah, nobody can help you with that. You're kind of on your own. Okay, so we're coming up on the 15-minute mark.